Good morning, everybody, at another Boardroom Bites at 9. How are you all doing this morning? I don't know where you are all coming from, but in Joburg, the sun is at least shining. Over the last couple of days, we had rain like summertime. So we are happy to see a bit of sunshine. Just to go through some functionalities of this morning. As you all know, we would like you guys to post any Q&As during the session in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. We use the chat box to say hello like you've done already this morning, or if you would like to share any links with us or any comments. Post them in there. And once the session is, once the session goes into Q&A, we will run through all those questions with you this morning. Without further ado, let me introduce Ngwakwana Moloto. Today's session is about how to design, lead, and sustain a human workforce for a digital ecosystem. This topic will offer practical insight on how future sustainability of product, services, and the execution thereof will manifest through strategic intervention and board oversight. This session's objective is to empower organizations to grow beyond commerce, building a sustainable competitive advantage whilst embedding a positive societal impact. Ngwakwana Moloto is a founder member and CRO of South Africa's Resources and Projects, a Pan-African risk assurance and project specialist firm. Ngwakwana is a seasoned ICT, product and financial services specialist with 20 years in a corporate investment banking landscape, including technology leadership participation. Welcome this morning, Ngwakwana. You can switch on your camera.
Good morning, everybody.
Good
Can
morning.
everybody hear me, see me clearly?
You are 100%, and you can also share your screen.
Okay. I trust we're all on board this morning. Great. So there is a minute delay, I think, in terms of the technology. But yes, thank you very much for the wonderful intro, Yohandi. And I'm delighted that everybody has come through to connect with everyone around this very topical focus area, which is obviously very pertinent as we read and hear all over the world. So without any further delay, let me jump straight into it. Hopeful that as we move into the digital ecosystem space, we can then hit the board running. So first and foremost, I just wanted to take the opportunity this morning really just to position the concept from a futuristic point of view. That being said, is digitization has been topical probably the last 8 to 10 years, and now has just resurrected really at the peak of a lot of senior conversations, as we can't avoid the impact of technology in the day-to-day working of both our staff, our colleagues, our suppliers, and our partners. And it's just become quite pivotal today, I think, as we take note of the changes within the global workplace, specifically for our human staff, as they have to now learn not only to interact with technology, but also interact with the broader ecosystem. And if we really just look at the word ecosystem, broadly speaking, it really is a combination of many different assets that connect and create a whole new digital world away from the material world. And as I go through the slides this morning, I'll just go a little bit deeper into that, and we can unpack further when we get to the Q&A session. So back to the concept positioning, I really wanted just to emphasize very briefly around the impact of the world as we know it today and the world that we will have to exist in the future. And digitization in the workplace predominantly has become quite a huge game changer. It's literally changed what we know in the traditional way of work from previous generations and in previous industrial revolutions. Now, the impact of this has many different schools of thought. Some believe it's positive, some believe it's negative, some believe it's something in the middle. And depending on where your organization is, few have actually conquered it today and are now basically sustaining. Others are thinking about it, either at a board level, executive level, or even operationally. and others are probably already in motion, but probably are trying to diversify different routes to success using the least number of very precious resources. So a very good source of information is a paper that was written in 2015, and it's still relevant today. It's around humanity in the digital age. It touches implicitly on cognitive, social, emotional, and ethical implications of how we operate in the world of work and some of the behaviors and patterns that have been picked up globally. And of course, from a South African perspective, which we will touch on later, we're actually not as isolated as sometimes we think we are. So I thought it was prudent maybe just to share some real good sources of literature, just to inspire some thinking and get some conversations going around the table as you prepare for being relevant in these times of digitization. And this particular paper was written by Professor Yunko Yamamoto, as well as Ananu Salisbury. They're very well seasoned in the space of human capital, in the space of learning, relearning, reactivating routines. And so if you really have a moment, I would implore you to read up on that. The second aspect of really being relevant in this space from a futuristic perspective really speaks to around the digital citizenship that companies are actually facing today. So no more can we just say we exist purely because of our brand promise or the quality or the strength of our products and services, but we literally have to be online. We've got to be present digitally. We've got to be accessible to the marketplace in which we choose to trade and serve. And we see more and more of this coming through, that even from a corporate governance perspective, the conversations have now pivoted to say, how do we become ethical, relevant digital citizens, primarily speaking? And this goes for commercial businesses as well as, non-profit driven organizations. The same standards of existence on an online platform is relevant to everybody. And there was a really great piece of work done by Deloitte. They published the 2021 Global Human Capital Trends Report. And I think it's awesome if you really are eager to read up on real stats that you can track and trace in terms of how humans are responding to technology, how technology is manifesting itself. And we'll touch on later on some of the thoughts around some of the key technical leaders globally around what they think in this trend analysis. So would definitely recommend that paper to read, or that report or something similar. And lastly, is very, very topical. What goes first? Is it digital? Then we kind of get our people on board and help them through the very lucrative change process. Or do we actually think of our people first and then work on digital to align to them? Different perspective, different schools of thought. And I think from my perspective, what I have experienced and what I've observed is that we can't negate from the fact that humans will ultimately always be part of our businesses and our organizations going forward. And as we gear up for the fourth industrial revolution, the one common asset or common denominator rather has always been our people. So I think it's always prudent from a leadership perspective to really focus on our people, and the technology has to work around them, not the other way around. If we do it the inverse, the impact would be loss of interest, loss of real talent, and really loss in profits at the end of the day. It's really been proven that there are some connections that we just can't avoid from a value chain perspective. And with that in mind, I actually went back in time and read a book that I'd read previously called First Break All the Rules. And I'm hopeful that a few people have heard
sorry
of it.
to interrupt you. There's a scratchy noise. I think it comes from your mic as you move. If you can maybe just mind that.
Right. Let me try and keep still. Is that better?
Yeah, that sounds fine. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Johandy. Apologies. So back on that. So the book First Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham and Kurt Kaufman is a really good indicator of what we can achieve and what we can really reflect on from a traditional perspective and keep the good things going and actually learn for the next. Then in terms of the dialogue, this is important to understand. I think if we're going to be effective leaders in our own right. There has been a huge focus around South Africa from a World Bank perspective. We often are a test case for trends continentally, and we can't shy away from that, good or bad. From a South African perspective, we are definitely seen as digital economy leaders in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of the knowledge base that we have, in terms of what we export and the type of economy that we have in existence. Albeit we are lagging behind in the developed world, but I think we are catching up very quickly in a positive light. But what does that mean for South Africa? And obviously, what does it reflect on in terms of ourselves, organizationally speaking? It means that for us to move forward continentally, and I think top of mind is the conversations around intra-Africa trade and businesses that are anchored within South Africa and want to explore and extend continentally and beyond. We can't negate from actually understanding the value that we can harness if we trade better, connect better, and actually do business better. And what that then means is that our workforces will inadvertently interact with each other cross borders and almost become a borderless ecosystem digitally, if you will. And so there's huge investments in regional digital development. You'll start to see talk around power going off grid. You'll start to hear talk around exporting of talent and skill in different areas for sustainability purposes. But I think at the crux of it from a leadership science perspective is the ability to disseminate best practices continentally, for us to be able to walk in unison, for us to be in a position where we can cultivate what we have and definitely reap the benefits for all involved. So the South African context moving forward is definitely of a leader, game changer, sort of breaking new ground, if you will, type of synergy, but not lacking with what we can learn from other areas or other countries across the continent and beyond. Then we've moved into this particular slide, and really the emphasis here of what we were trying to portray was at a glance, how do we plan better for our staff and our workforce in a manner that's manageable, in a manner that's clear and concise, so everybody can almost, sing from the same hymn sheet, if you will. And for our view, there's probably three areas that no one should really negate from or ignore. The first one is around impact. We've just got to get a sense of where the value needs to be, where does the value need to be harnessed, and where do we need to create the value. And that typically comes from the board. The board has got huge responsibility in terms of oversight, specifically in the digitization space, because literally will change the way of work. It may start to impact on different business models, if you will, regionally, globally, otherwise, even domestically. But at the crux of it, we want to be able to say, how do we contain our ability to keep our license to trade as a going concern? Very, very important, without leaving behind any of the GRC implications in terms of the benchmarks and making sure that we meet the expectations from a shareholder perspective. Then when we move into the solutioning part of it, this is very important, as we referred to in the previous slide, people first at technology. It's a very important mantra that literally says your world of work will always be firstly maintained for your ability to perform at your best, to be most productive, and really meet the requirements of the environment in which you operate in. And these are not mutually exclusive, they need to work together. And in that regard, we need to be able to explain and articulate to our teams what is the value of the existence of your role, and how does this shape up in a world futuristically from a technology or a digitization perspective. The second element of that would be, how do we then transform, right? And this is beyond change. How do we literally make sure that we don't lose out on your value, your experience, your talent, your skill from a traditional perspective, moving into a digitized space? And how do we then harness and translate the knowledge of what you know in a world where it's accessible by many people? so that there's fewer interactions of repetitive work, but more interactions for creative work and co-creation. That's really how the world of work is really going to look like. And if you read up quite extensively on some of the research papers done by the International Labour Organization, you will then start to pick up some patterns and trends around their reference to fair work practices in relation to technology. And a classic example would be a typical contact center environment, which was 8 to 5, and now it's flipping to 24/7. At what point do we introduce robotic interventions? Because we can't have staff working 24 hours a day, but we need to have the ability to respond to the needs if we want to work in a multi-zoned, multi-geographical environment, for example. And this would be the space in which we then start to craft the best strategy for our staff, with them at the core and technology following in terms of what they need, and sustaining both of those two key elements for success. In the last pillar, and there aren't 3 pillars, by the way. This is really in terms of what we've seen in terms of the test cases for the last 3 to 4 years. These come out most prominently, but they probably are more and will be different for each context of a team or an organization, if you will. The last piece really speaks about sustainability, and sustainability is very core, right, futuristically. It's around creating the value beyond the here and the now, and beyond the leadership you might have, or beyond the staff that you might have currently employed, but really setting up the foundation for the right leverage to take place. So infrastructure investments, we can't step away from that. The question would be, what does that mean for organizations? Where do we get our best return on that investment? And when can we be sure that we are solid enough that we are ready to trade and do business in the next sort of 10 to 20 years? That's a forecast timeline, I think. Then how do we coexist with other digital instruments and assets, right? People aren't machines. Robots are becoming more naturalized in certain parts of the world. I don't think South Africa is quite there yet, but the conversations are on the table and we can't ignore them. We almost need to be sure that we have a response to some of the questions that might come from there. And lastly, always very important, people value. What does it mean? How do I translate it into a job or a role? How do I support my staff? And how do I inspire them to basically take on board the investments that we've made and really make best use of them at the right time? Then in terms of the intrinsic value, value is a topical discussion. Everything that we do surrounds value. What's in it for me type of question line. We have to be in a position to respond to that as leaders. Why do I have to do this? What will the return be? How is this relevant in the here and the now? How do we become a better organization, better people, better leaders? We can't shy away from the risk lens. And a lot of what I've shared this morning, very briefly, is around opening up the insights a little bit and shining on a light on key things that are pertinent for a successful design, implementation, and sustainability of a positive, energized workforce that's ready for digitization. I think that's typically a good perspective to have as a leader. We have to ascertain what are the critical value drivers. So why actually should I bother about digitization? Why can't I just operate the way I've always operated, and just sort of stick it through? Well, unfortunately, I think those days are gone. In every industrial revolution, there has been pluses and minuses, and you definitely don't want to be on the minus side. The minus side is normally you get left behind. That's the impact, right? You cease to exist as if you were never there. So that's not ideal. So it's important that we need to capture that essence. We need to be in a position to understand that our staff need to be liberated now to be able to connect and work and collaborate wherever they are in a digitized manner. And the past pandemic, I think, has emphasized a little bit of what that means. And as organizations then decide to follow a hybrid model again of returning back to the office or working remotely, the key fundamental point is always around value. So people should be where value is created, where value is sustained, and value can then be equally regenerated and re-engineered going forward. The people risk drivers, we can't shy away from the risk. Every decision we make might have an implication, which is for or against us from a strategy perspective. So it's just important just to bank that and make sure that we can articulate that and monetize that particular impact. And also, what does it mean for our people? And give the ability for them to have a say in the conversation. The voice of our employees is just as important as voice of our customers, as a model to really dissect and tap into what is top of mind for most of our staff. The risk always is around the data. So these conversations always will be subdued by the data conversation. How safe is my data? How much can I capture of the data? How do I collect it? How do I store it? How do I transfer it? That's important. Digitization will never happen without data. That is the bloodline of digitization. And we need to be comfortable with that synopsis and prepare for that in terms of doing it in an ethical, unbiased, equitable manner. I think that really is the challenge from a leadership perspective. And lastly, without repeating that, is really just to make sure, do my staff have what they need? Or rather, let me say, the strategy that we want to conquer and compete on in the marketplace, are we tooled up for it? You know, do our people have everything they need, materially and otherwise, knowledge, information? Do they connect to the ideals of the organization? And these seem very traditionalist at the very core. But in the digitized space, the greater test is how much of that can we transfer? How much of that can be reviewed? How much of that can be reset and rebuilt and once again reconnected and re-engaged? That actually is the challenge. Not so much the what, but probably more of the how. And so what could the future then look like if we followed some of those ideals as previous slides have displayed? We then move into a context that says, at what point would I start the journey? And what we're trying to emphasize here is this is how you start. This is typically how you would build your roadmap. You've got to have an appreciation of digital workers, how they fit. That could be robots or a robotic intervention. That could be an element of artificial intelligence, which is quite a buzzword in the last couple of months or so. Everybody's talking about it, the ethics behind it, the what to behind it, and whether we appreciate it or not, technology moves way faster than legislation. So this is basically a world that's growing without rules. So it can be positive, but it also can be very dangerous. So the art here is to balance the two in time. What of our programmed outputs are relevant? So if we take a manufacturing industry, for example, there's certain things that we know, this is the ingredients, this is the product, and this is the output, and this is the standard, and we're good to go. But from a digitized perspective, how much of that can be programmed? And that speaks to artificial intelligence as well. And by the way, there's been no conclusive evidence that artificial intelligence rather, can actually ever replace human intelligence. And I don't think we'll get there. But that speaks around the ethics behind a lot of the debate that's going on today. And I think Elon Musk, for example, had an interview recently, and I'll share a quote around what he shared specifically around the AI space. We then have to have a concise view of what the ecosystem actually looks like and what's in there. It's not prescribed because it's very new, and hence why the design, of it is important. The sustainability of it is important, and how we support our staff to get it right the first time. That's ideal. But generally speaking, it's a computerized landscape, right? It has hardware assets, it has software assets, it has data assets. And if you strung these four together at a very bare minimum, you've got your ecosystem already live and ticking. So the question would be, what other elements would be required just to beef it up based on the context. The people workers got to protect the human intelligence, and you've got to make sure that people can think, grow, pursue their dreams career-wise, but also align to what is required and really think out problems. At the crux of it, we have our staff to help us solve problems from a day-to-day perspective, and we need to create a conducive space for that. We need to also understand that there's an element of structured operations. That's where the standards come in. And lastly, how does the delivery look like? What's important makes us relevant. On this particular slide, the question always pertains, why are we doing this? Why should we take an interest in digitization and specifically setting our staff up for success, or our partners for success, and our leaders for success? What is the case for change? And is it something that will happen automatically, or do we actively need to participate in it? And this slide really helps to display, if not demonstrate, some of the pertinent questions or issues that need to be covered so the right focus areas come through. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all. It will never be a one-size-fits-all. There are certain unique traits within organizations, and those need to be adequately and digitally, or rather diligently, responded to. But at the cuff of it, we then need to be able to understand who and what is in our digital ecosystem. That's important. What is the priority? So what matters? Is it function or architecture? Or in a different way, is it function over form? Is how I look like more important than what I do or produce, or the other way around? Where do I keep all the information? So we've had knowledge management around for a while, over decades. The challenge with digitization is beyond the knowledge, where's the data at the very raw level of it? So where are the bits and bytes? How do I store them? How do I secure them? And how do I move them from place to place to make sure that they become relevant and we don't lose on the substance of it? And cloud computing is a typical offshoot of that conversation. And beyond all of this is, so what's then relevant so that I have the right team behind me? And these are the generational conversations around the generation of tomorrow will be completely digitized from school. So by the time they hit the world of work, they in a natural domain. Whereas today we still need to train people, we need to support them to adapt and almost retrain continuously till they get it right. At the base level of that conversation would be, so what's the leadership ethos? And why is that important? So a lot of these elements have to consider ethical leadership, and that's almost non-negotiable from my books. It's absolutely important that we do things the right way, with the right intent, with the right spirit. I think that's very key. And that's what differentiates successful organizations from not so successful organizations. And lastly is, so where's the culture? So this particular question always gets people a bit uncomfortable, which is good, because it forces the point to say, do we even know the locus of control where it sits around digitization? Typically, most people would think it should sit in tech, but tech is no longer isolated, right? It's literally moved beyond its own universe and has become part and parcel of the commerce of the business. So one should not ideally engage with tech at most key points of decision making, because technology has literally become an asset overnight, and will remain so, I think, for a very long time until something else is discovered and we move on to a different industry or journey, whichever comes first. So these 6 questions really just trigger the design piece, also help you in the build piece, but also make sure that we have a grip on the sustainability of what we want to do if at any point we need to consider preparing our teams to become more digital savvy. And here's really what I would like to look at these quotes. And Elon Musk actually shared this when he was interviewed around AI and where he thinks it will start and end and what does it mean for humanity in general. And I quote, he'll say, over time, I think we probably will see a closer merger of biological intelligence and digital intelligence. It can sound positive, maybe a bit scary at this point in time, but it's very, very true. Artificial intelligence has become bigger than what I think the initial developers thought. The advent of avatars, the advent of many tool sets literally are picking up on human behavior like machine learning and different algorithms that we see in social media. You literally can start to see that today. So the question is, how do we respond to it responsibly, if you will? And Angela Arendt then said, and I think this quote for me just surmises all of what I've really said in previous slide. She says, and I quote, I grew up in the physical world and I speak English. The next generation is growing up in a digital world and they speak social. So that's literally where we are today in this space. And our staff are not oblivious to this. They're exposed to this every single day. And so we do ourselves a disservice if we don't actually get going on some of these things. Then lastly, I thought it's important to move beyond the topical conversations and get to the real crux of seeing it in motion. And I would almost recommend this Global Digital Regulatory Outlook, which was published by the World Bank in 2023. I think it's Q1 of this year. It talks about policy and regulation, very, very important from the holders of governance and the people that look at risk and compliance and control, all the key things around business, very important. So I would suggest the read up on that, as well as the Global Connectivity Report, also released last year. It literally speaks around the infrastructure and how a digital ecosystem could look like. Really good case studies in sub-Saharan Africa, very relevant to us. And then lastly, around a diagnostic report by country. And I think if we look at the South African one, we'll take note of how far or how close we are to digitization, broadly speaking. And this is really the end of my presentation in terms of really just trying to inspire some thinking and thoughts around preparing our teams in that regard. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity. And back to you, Yohandi. Happy to hear from the forum.
Thank you so much. We've got some questions that came in. The first one here is from Osman. How does digital impact the value system of people, and what mechanisms should be in place to manage this?
Good question. I'll answer it in two parts. I think the first thing is people come to work with different values, right? And some people are pro technology and others aren't. And I think from an employee or staff perspective, we need to be able to connect the what I do to the value of technology all the time. I think I wanted to think a little bit more about your question to think of a more refined answer. But I think at the cup of it, it's really what we do. And in terms of how do we then respond from an organizational perspective, we need to be able to have almost a think tank group that's just there to listen and hear and respond and co-create that environment as best as possible that people can feel they can connect digitally, they can learn how to do it, and then become successful in their roles. I hope that covers some elements of your question, but I would like to have a written response if I can at some point post this call.
Thank you. We'll connect you with Osman. Another question that came through, what skills and competencies are required to successfully work alongside ChatGPT in a digital workforce? And how can organizations ensure that their employees are adequately prepared for this shift?
Yeah. So I personally didn't mention ChatGPT because I'm still trying to study it myself, the pros and cons behind it. But I think the skills issue is quite broad, but one key skill is gamification, the ability to read data and translate that into something of value that can make sense, right? So if you look at a company like Pixar, they use a lot of data to create imagery. So the same type of thing, using data to create modeling is typically one of the basic skill sets to literally, if that is a platform like ChatGPT, is that something that somebody wants to work with, they can do it. But it's also very responsive, and it has a high tendency of artificial intelligence. And I think that's the challenge around it, is that there'll be less human input, but more machine processing behind it to get the right outcome. So for me, that would be the skills. And in terms of preparing the workforce there, as I said before, development skills, not so much. But I think commercially speaking, people literally need to be comfortable that what I type and see on my screen can now be used to create different images and pictures and words and models. So my ability to be able to use the right language that the machine or the robotics can learn is probably the skills that we actually are looking for futuristically. So you don't need to be a tech expert, but you definitely need to be tech savvy, and really be able to understand that now word and speed and thinking and logic will be translated computeristically.
Thank you. Neil commented on the previous question where he said, quite interesting. If I may throw the spanner in the works, where does it leave other stakeholders who benefited economically and socially from the traditional way of doing business?
Yes, we get that a lot. I think, sure. The challenge is really generational. So let's be clear about that. And business will always be business, right? The question is, it's not the what, it's probably the how. So the digitization world is challenging how we do business. Your ability to be digitally present. It's not good enough to have a website, but is it interactive? And that website, what information do I have? And what can I glean from it as a consumer of a product? So that changes the game. That then means that my investment is moving away from bricks and mortar to more digital, as simple as that and as practical as that. The second piece would be, unfortunately, digitization at the cusp of humanity is creating greater gaps between human interaction than traditional business actually promoted. So your sales teams can no longer be visiting clients, in planned booked meetings and dish out brochures and things like that. It's completely a dematerialized zone. There's no paper. It's absolutely a paperless world. And for your sales team, they've got to have the ability to connect faster than a robot to a user. And I'm not sure if anybody's experienced it. If you go in one of those online retail stores, within 2 seconds, there's a robot that says, "Hi, I'm Jane. Can I help you with something? What are you looking for?" And already you don't need to speak to anybody or call a call center to just check if a particular product is available in a color or a stock. So all I'm trying to say is, if one needs to be relevant in the next 5 to 10 years, because that's how fast it's moving, you literally have to keep the core fundamentals of your business model working. I don't think that will change. What will change is your target operating model, is your ability then to get to the customer. And digitization then provides that opportunity to do so. I hope that kind of covers it.
Thank you. That was really nice. Another question, looking at the quotes that you've shared about the newer generations that speak social, how do we address this gap, this generation gap? Should we be employing Generation Y?
Yes, of course. I think you should be employing all generations. I'm definitely not a supporter of completely just hiring for a particular type of generation. The generations previous will always have the wisdom of doing business, and I think one cannot replace that. Not even a younger person can replace it over time. They're just some things that you learn through business that you just can't replicate in a textbook or a syllabus. But organizations do themselves a disservice if they don't upskill on the Generation Ys fairly quickly, because in their world, digitization is as natural as drinking water. In our world, it's still a choice. to whether I want to interact with it or not. And I probably can get away with it to some degree. But in their world, I mean, they will hit the world of work at phenomenal speed. The risk is that we will lose them. We will not be able to retain them, attract them, and therefore you're going to see a high churn rate of candidates like that, and your talent pool will be very unstable. And that's never good for business, right? So yes, in the long and short is hire more of the futuristic type of generations, but not at the cost of wisdom and knowledge, I think, of years previously.
I definitely agree. I think there's pros and cons to all generations.
Yeah.
So this also brings us to another similar question. How do you balance the influx of digital, and how do you ensure that your staff get the right information and are empowered through this?
I think the challenge will always be, do I ignore it or do I slow it down? Either way, there is going to be a consequence behind it. So if you stop the influx, you are almost discounting opportunities in the marketplace. And the question would then be, are you comfortable to live with that leadership? What would be your counter response to that? So that's important to hear, but you can't ignore it because even your consumers are becoming more digital. So whether you choose to do it or not, the marketplace will do it. So it's either you do it, participate, or will be done to you. And you never want to be, paint yourself into a corner. I think as an organization, you almost want to be proactive where you can, albeit at your pace, right? That's why the roadmap is important. And that's why we were quite deliberate to say these are the 3 areas that you can look at. The digital workers, the human workers, your ecosystem helps you dictate the pace at which you want to advance or transform. I don't know, was there a second part to that question? I think I missed.
Just see here. And how are we empowered through this? But I think you sort of answered that.
Yes, I think the first thing is be topical. So definitely read up. There's a lot of great think tanks. I think the different business chambers of commerce are a good way to connect with other businesses that are grappling with this. In terms of for example, the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa, which I'm part of, a lot of the conversations today are around the risk of technology, of what does it mean? And as risk specialists, how do we translate that into proper business value, in terms of commercial conversations? And so I think broadly speaking, you've got to find the knowledge. You've got to align with the right people who actually do this on a daily basis and make it their business to help your businesses transform and get better. But also, I think the tech teams and the different spaces also have a responsibility to be able to assist and guide. And I think that's always a good start, first internally, before going external.
Thank you. Ngwakwana, we've got another 3 questions here. Let's see. Victoria Sepiwe has got a really nice comment. Warren Buffett expressed concern over AI. His opinion on the scary nature of AI. He said he highlights AI growth and compared it invention of an atom bomb.
Yeah.
Nice.
Very nice.
Okay,
true to some degree, but nice, yes.
Yeah, it is true. I think it's also scary, and it's it's almost like an unknown thing. We're not sure exactly where it's going to go. Silindile said, yeah, good morning. Thanks for a wonderful presentation and insight. How best do you propose we prepare our homes and our children for rate of transformation currently at the speed of light, whilst balancing the reality and mental health brought about by socialization?
Wow. That sounds like a World Economic Forum question, but I will attempt to answer it. I think, first of all, technology, I think we can't negate from the fact that we control our environment as people. So you should be able to determine how much of technology you're prepared to embrace or not embrace. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule that you have to respond at this phenomenal pace It is fast, yes, of course, but you can choose how you want to interact with it. And specifically, I think on social media, which is very unhealthy. And if you do take time to read the paper that I mentioned previously, The Impact of Humanity, Technology on Humanity, written by the professors in the US, they actually spend a lot of time looking at that, around the mental health issues that have come up with children in the US who live on their phones for 4 hours at a time a day that parents are unaware of, for example. And similarly in the workplace, people that are always switched on, that there's no switch off. So the challenge would be, there's just an overload of information, but is it valuable information and is it taken in at the right pace? That's the first thing. Secondly, I think one always has to be responsible enough around the content. And I think that's probably why, from a home perspective, I think the more the parents or the senior people at home need to understand the content of what people are reading and engaging with, because content becomes naturalized in the mind. People start to compute things and then make up decisions and take principles and then they act. So the key thing is that responsibility you can't negate from. It actually is around the home place. And is home a place of tech or is home a place of just being human? I think would be the question. From the workplace perspective, not so regulated, because I think there's a view that people actually come to work, hopefully, right? But if people are forever living on the internet and, they're just on these different tools that just don't add to the premise of why they exist, we're going to run into issues. And it's just exhaustion. Your human mind and your brain has got a point where it just needs to rest. It's just how we're wired. That's biologically how we are. So once we start breaching that, that's when we're going to start having issues. Emotional ones, mental ones, physical ones even, health issues. So we just need to watch that. But I think it's just assuming control, because you can never lose control unless you give it away. I think that's the point that sits underneath the whole digitization debate.
Dudu's mentioning here, technology particularly, he says AI is as wise and effective as the quality of human intelligence inputting the data. Thus, technical savviness in terms of generations is less important, or should be, for the benefit of humanity. He says, example, the ethical questions seem to be an afterthought to a lot of inventions because the technical sophistication still needs judgment and discernment. Don't know if you would like to comment on that.
Brilliant theory. I actually like that. Of course, I agree. I agree from a neutral perspective, working with tech and being a tech person by training. I think the challenge on the ground is human innovation cannot be regulated on a whim or on the fly. So the people that have created a tool like WhatsApp, there was no legislation around it, around what you can share, how many people you can add. Pop gear hadn't kicked in, for example, from an SA perspective. It just wasn't there, and we're never going to be like that. I guess the point is, that's why you need people who are the right office bearers and the right custodians of these environments, whose job and duty it is to just tap in at the right time and observe unhealthy outputs out of it, to say, actually, this needs to be tracked, this needs to be reported on, this needs to be regulated. Because if we don't, it could become something that is beyond our means to control. So that would be my response to that. But I think gone are the days where we're expecting somebody to regulate it first and then we use it based on the regulation. Technology has never been like that, and the innovation is never like that. So the point is, at any point when people interact with the technology or they choose to subscribe to an app or something like that, they really should read up on the terms and conditions, which I think very few people do, but they should, to see who's got access to your cell phone, your images, your voice calls, your estimate, whatever it is. And then choose, am I okay with this? And should this fall into the wrong hands or used for the wrong purposes? What would then be my response to it? I think that needs to be set at that individual or corporate level. Yeah.
Thank you. Parker mentions, how are we protected from transformation consultants who are both the service providers and suppliers of the softwares, and they tend to impose to clients unnecessary staff? Is there some assessors for proper leverage?
I'm not too clear, I think, on the question, but it sounds like the crux of it is how do we limit the unethical behavior, I suppose, that could exist,
Yeah.
being a provider or service provider or supplier. I'm not too sure the context. Why it would be good to get a good example. But with that being said, I think once again we've just got to be prudent, right? So when one looks for a service provider, I think the contracts need to be in such a way that you're able to appreciate what you're paying for, what you're getting. And if anything is untoward, that should be then the playback. To say this is actually not what we signed up for, this is not what we agreed to in good faith. Can we address it? But it's just not clear enough for me to give a proper response. I'm sorry. But I can follow up in writing.
Yes, Parker, if that wasn't clear, maybe just pose it again for us and we can address it. There's another comment here from Mark Feller. He says this might be a nice conversation point around the language and narrative used by organizations when speaking of technology and jobs become obsolete, replacing jobs. He says, and how those on the receiving end hear that and how they feel about that whilst trying to avoid controversy at work and maintain their employment. Very interesting.
Very interesting. And I think it's a very real issue. So thank you for raising that. I think in our line of work, when we actually do try and give an advisory approach or supportive approach around how we help organizations digitize and prepare for it properly. And recall at one of the point, I literally say people first at digital. That is very key. And a lot of that surmises how we speak and the vocabulary that we have. And it's also a generational issue because a lot of the taglines might be relevant for X's and Y's, I suppose. And maybe baby boomers don't know that, right? But back to the world of work, when we say things like we need to automate this department, that's a definite no-no. Because what does that mean, actually? What we mean is we need to automate some of the processes within this area, but you can't automate an entire department because that means I'm completely getting rid of the human component, and I think that's problematic. So the best thing is to almost educate ourselves around what digitization is and isn't, and it's often open up to many interpretations, which actually creates fault lines between leadership and staff. And probably that's what I'm hearing here a little bit of. So the crux of it is to say, but what do we mean by digitization? That's what I'm saying. We need to talk about what does it mean for the company? What's the context, right? What is the case for change? That's important. Secondly, things like replace, transform, rearrange. There are better ways and words to use that are positive. And if we really put the staff at the core of this, it will always be positive. Staff respond to positive language and positive vibes. That's like leadership 101, right? And we need to then affirm our staff during the journey, but we can't use words like obsolete, redundant, you're not skilled. That doesn't work because humans can relearn things. That's our human intelligence. And that's why artificial intelligence will never necessarily replace human intelligence, no matter how close it can become, because we have emotions and we have behaviors that cannot be easily replicated. You can code it in a machine, but you can't replicate it. Yeah. So I think that's another write-up that I can do.
That's very nice. Yeah.
Just want to be sure that the message lands properly.
Yeah. So we've gone through all our questions. Anybody else would like a question before we close the session? Seems we are all knowledgeable on the digital world that we need to prepare ourselves for. Thank you so much, Ngwakwana, for bringing this to our attention. Oh, let me see. There is a raised hand before I close. Give me a sec.
Sure.
We've got John Povey. Let me just... Okay, you are unmuted, John. You can ask your question. Not yet. He's not yet unmuted. Oh, can you unmute yourself, John? There we go. Floor is yours, John.
I can't hear John. Has he said something?
Not yet. Just give him another second. John, are you still happy to ask your question there? It seems not.
Okay.
Okay, guys, thank you so much, Ngwakwana. Thank you for showing us some direction into the world of digitization and how we bring this into the workforce and how we deal with it. This presentation, as well as the video, will be made available to everyone in this session. Maybe, Ngwakwana, you can just forward to the next slide with your information. If anybody would like to get in touch with Ngwakwana, you are more than welcome to contact her directly, follow her on LinkedIn. Yes, and let us know if you need anything. You can contact the IODSA for any more information. Thank you once again for this lovely session.
Thank you very much. And to everybody involved, I really do appreciate it. I enjoyed my morning. Thanks a lot.